She had never trusted Stirling. That was the only completely honest thing Nola could say about herself, after 3 years of working inside his operation. 3 years of sitting across from men who lied for a living, learning to read the lies in the numbers before she could read them in their faces. Stirling ran his empire out of a converted heritage building in Yaletown, the kind of place that had exposed brick and industrial lighting, and cost more per square foot than anywhere Nola had grown up in Surrey. His legitimate business was a property development and logistics consultancy. His actual business was the port of Vancouver, the flow of containers in and out of Deltaport, and a web of shell companies so carefully constructed that she'd spent her first 6 months just mapping them. She hadn't even found the edges yet. She was his forensic accountant. That was the official title, the one that appeared on the letterhead of the numbered company that paid her salary. What she actually did was stand between Stirling and the Canada Revenue Agency, between his empire and daylight, finding the hairline fractures in the ledgers before anyone else could. She had answered a job posting 3 years ago without knowing what the job was. She'd been 26, working for a mid-sized audit firm downtown, and someone had passed along her name for a private consulting position. The meeting had been in this same building. Stirling had sat across from her and placed a single spreadsheet on the table. He'd told her to find the problem. She had found 11 problems in 4 minutes. He had said, "You start Monday." She had said, "I need to know what I'm getting into." He had looked at her for a long moment. His face wasn't the kind that gave much away. There were 2 scars on the left side of his jaw, old and faded, the kind that came from something specific, and his eyes were the flat, assessing grey of a person who had learned long ago to measure everything against cost. He was 42. He looked like a man who had stopped expecting anything to be simple. "You're already in it," he had said. "You found the 11 discrepancies. You know what they mean." She had. She'd known the moment she looked at the spreadsheet. She'd also known, sitting in that office with its view of False Creek, that she could walk out and file a report, or she could sit down and do the most intellectually demanding work of her life. She had thought about her mother's house in Surrey, the mortgage with 2 years left on it, her brother's tuition. She had sat down. That was the cage she'd built herself, and she'd known it going in. That was the part nobody ever acknowledged in these kinds of situations, that sometimes people chose the cage because the world outside was just a different kind of trap with worse lighting. 3 years later, Nola knew the empire better than anyone except Stirling himself. She knew which shell companies were load-bearing and which were decorative. She knew which port officials were on the payroll and which ones had simply been persuaded to look the other way. She knew Stirling's tells, the slight tightening around his left eye when a number was wrong, the way he went very still when he was actually angry instead of performing it for a room. She was the only person in his operation who argued with him regularly and kept her job. The first time she'd pushed back on his approach to a Deltaport contract, he'd looked at her the way he looked at most people who disagreed with him. A flat, considering stare, calculating the cost of the inconvenience. Then he'd listened to her reasoning. Then he'd changed the approach. He hadn't thanked her. He had simply moved on to the next item, as though her being right was a data point rather than a conversation. She had stopped expecting thanks by month 3. What she had instead was the knowledge that he trusted her work completely, which in Stirling's world was worth considerably more than anyone's approval. The night it started to come apart was a Tuesday in November. Rain, obviously rain. This was Vancouver. Nola was packing up at 6:30, something she almost never did. She had somewhere to be. Stirling came out of his office as she was putting on her coat. He walked to his assistant's desk. She had her own office now, across the hall, and picked up a folder she'd left for him. He opened it, scanned the first page, and frowned. The Harbour Pacific accounts need to be reconciled by Thursday. The Matsui meeting is Friday morning. "I know," Nola said. "I'll have them done tomorrow." He looked at the coat. He looked at the time. He didn't say anything. He had never, in 3 years told her what hours to work. She had simply worked all of them because the work was always there, and he had counted on that. "I have a personal appointment," Nola said, before he could find a way to express the question without asking it. "I'll be in early tomorrow." The word personal landed in the room like a stone dropped in water. Stirling's expression didn't change. It never really changed. But something shifted behind his eyes. A very slight recalibration, the kind she'd learned to notice. "Fine," he said. He returned to his office. She took the elevator down and stood in the rain on Hamilton Street for a moment, telling herself she didn't owe him an explanation, which was true, and also that she didn't feel like she'd done something slightly wrong, which was less true. Elliot Crane had gone to school with her. They'd done their CPA exams the same year, worked at competing firms, ended up at the same industry dinners for 4 years running. He was the kind of person who remembered her order at coffee shops and sent articles about tax policy with notes in the margins. He was, by most reasonable standards, a decent man. He'd asked her to dinner 6 months ago. She'd said she was busy. He'd asked again 2 months ago. She'd said the same thing. Last week he had said, "Nola, I know you're busy. You've been busy for 3 years. Do you want to have dinner or not?" She'd said yes, mostly because she couldn't explain why she kept saying no without explaining her actual life, and explaining her actual life was not something she was prepared to do. They went to a place in Gastown she liked, narrow and warm, the kind of restaurant where the lighting was low and the wine list was serious. Elliot was exactly as he always was, easy to talk to, genuinely interested in what she said, laughing at the right moments. He reached across the table at one point to show her something on his phone, and his hand rested near hers for a moment, easy and undemanding. She didn't move her hand. She realized, having a perfectly pleasant evening. It felt strange, like trying on a coat she used to own and finding it still fit. She didn't notice the figure standing outside on Water Street. Nola found out about Elliot's contract on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks later. She was rooting through the financial architecture of a legitimate construction bid. Stirling occasionally ran legitimate construction. It was part of the cover when she found a shell company doing something it shouldn't have been doing. A consulting services agreement had been moved, quietly, the kind of thing that looked like a routine procurement reshuffle, unless you knew what the holding company behind the acquiring firm actually was. She knew. She pulled the metadata. She checked the transfer date. It was the Wednesday after her dinner with Elliot. She sat back in her chair. The rain pressed at the window. The office was quiet. Her hands were very still on the keyboard. She pulled Elliot's professional profile on her second screen. Senior Manager, Pacific Rim Advisory Group, the firm that had just lost a major federal infrastructure contract to a competitor with murky ownership. A contract loss significant enough that several managers were being restructured, offered transfers to the Toronto office or severance. Toronto. Nola stared at both screens for a long time. Then she stood up, walked across the hall, and opened Stirling's door without knocking. He was at his desk. He didn't look up right away. He was reading something, his forearms resting on the desk surface, his reading glasses on, which he hated and never wore when anyone else was around. He took them off before he raised his eyes. "You moved a contract," Nola said. She kept her voice very level. Stirling set the glasses on the desk. He looked at her. "Specify." She walked to his desk and placed the printout in front of him. She had circled the shell company's routing number in red pen, precise, methodical, the same way she marked every discrepancy she found. Pacific Rim Advisory Group. Federal infrastructure contract, quietly redirected through a holding company you have 3 degrees of separation from. The week after I had dinner in Gastown. Silence. Stirling looked at the printout. He did not look at her. He was going to be transferred regardless, Stirling said. The firm was overextended. You accelerated it. I managed a variable. He's a person, Nola said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended, which was worse. He's a person who didn't do anything to you. He took me to dinner. He touched your hand." The words came out before Stirling could stop them. She saw it happen, the slight contraction of his jaw, the immediate awareness that he had said the actual true thing instead of the managed version. He picked up a pen and set it down again. He did not take the words back. Nola looked at the man sitting across from her. She had spent 3 years learning to read the margins of his ledgers, the faint traces of what he actually valued versus what he claimed to value. She had never, until this moment, thought to turn that skill on him directly. He had watched her. He had stood somewhere outside that restaurant in the rain on Water Street and watched her. And then he had come back to this office and opened his encrypted phone and begun moving pieces on a board she hadn't known she was standing on. The fury that moved through her was very clean. She had expected mess. She'd expected to feel frightened or confused. Instead, she felt the same sharp clarity she got when she found a fraudulent entry in a ledger at 2 in the morning. Everything reduced to a single, obvious fact. "You don't own me," Nola said. "You pay me, that is not the same thing." "I'm aware of the difference." "Are you?" Stirling was quiet. The rain shifted against the windows. "You can't account for every variable," Nola said. She picked up the printout. She folded it once precisely and put it in her jacket pocket. "That's what you've always called them, variables, assets, controlled outcomes. I've watched you do it for 3 years. You run everything like a ledger. Income, expenditure, risk, managed." She paused. "But you moved a contract to get a man transferred to Toronto because he was sitting across a table from me. That's not calculation, Stirling. That's a tantrum." She saw it again, the tightening around his left eye. She had always read that as a response to a wrong number. She understood now it was the tell for something else entirely. She turned and walked to the door. "Nola." His voice was the same controlled register he used for everything. She stopped, her hand not yet on the handle. "Your contract rolls over in January. I'll increase the retainer by 30%. She looked at him over her shoulder. He was watching her with that grey, assessing attention, and for the first time she saw clearly what she had been looking at for 3 years. A man who had no language for what he wanted except the language of transaction, because transactions were the only territory where he believed he couldn't lose. "You can't buy your way out of this one," she said. She walked out. She called Elliot that same evening. She told him there was a conflict of interest she hadn't anticipated, that she couldn't see him again, that she was sorry. She kept it vague. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Yeah, okay," in a voice that told her he'd suspected something like this. He was decent about it. She hated that he was decent about it. She sat in her apartment in Mount Pleasant, in the quiet she usually came home to without noticing, and noticed it. She sent her work remotely for 2 weeks. She did not go into the Yaletown office. Stirling did not contact her. The accounts continued. She had built the systems well enough that they ran on their own for short stretches. She worked her contracted hours and not a minute more, and told herself this was what a normal professional boundary felt like. It felt mostly like holding her breath. She ran 5 kilometers along the seawall every morning and tried to think about what she wanted her life to look like in a year. The honest answer was that she didn't know. She had been so focused on knowing exactly what each day would require of her that the question of what she actually wanted had stopped feeling like a real question somewhere along the way. She thought about the printout in her jacket pocket. She thought about Stirling saying, "He touched your hand with that flat, terrible precision, as though he'd been filing the observation for weeks, and it had finally slipped out of the wrong drawer." She thought about 3 years of working beside a man who ran everything like a ledger, who trusted no one's numbers but hers, who sat across from her in that office day after day, and never once gave any indication that she was anything other than a line item on a balance sheet. And then she thought about what it meant that he had stood in the rain. It was her own network that told her about the CRA review. She still had contacts from her previous life. Colleagues who'd moved into forensic accounting on the government side, people who owed her professional courtesies. One of them sent her a careful, oblique message on a Friday morning. She read it twice. The Canada Revenue Agency had opened a pre-assessment review of a numbered company connected to Stirling's Harbour Pacific accounts. It wasn't a full audit yet, but it would become one. Someone had made an error in the Q3 reconciliation. A routing number transposed, the kind of mistake that would have taken her 30 seconds to catch if she'd been there. She sat with her coffee going cold and did the arithmetic. 48 hours, maybe 60. Before the review escalated. If the Harbour Pacific accounts were frozen, it would cascade. She knew exactly which shell companies it would touch first. She knew because she had built the system. She had also built the safeguards. She had always built the safeguards, and she had told herself it was professionalism. But sitting here now, she understood that she had built them because some part of her had always known, in the quiet of the early mornings when she worked alone, that she couldn't fully trust anyone else to protect what she had helped construct. She wasn't sure what to call that. She put on her coat. The Yaletown building was quiet on a Saturday afternoon. The front desk wasn't staffed. Nola had a key card. She took the elevator up and walked down the familiar hallway. Stirling's office door was open. He was at his desk. He had a stack of papers in front of him and the reading glasses on again. He looked like a man attempting surgery on himself, focused and controlled and visibly not achieving what he needed. She stood in the doorway for 2 full seconds before he heard her. When he looked up, something crossed his face that she hadn't seen before. It lasted less than a second. She'd spent 3 years catching things that lasted less than a second. The Harbour Pacific reconciliation has a transposed routing number in the Q3 report, she said. Whoever did it reversed 2 digits on the 416 account. The CRA has already flagged it. You have 48 hours before it escalates. Stirling took off the glasses. He set them on the desk. "Sit down," he said. "I'm not here to come back." She stayed in the doorway. "I'm here because the system is mine, and I'd rather fix it myself than watch someone else make it worse." Nola. The way he said her name was different. Not a summons, not a command. She had heard him say her name hundreds of times across 3 years, always with the same controlled, professional delivery. This was different in a way she couldn't immediately classify. She stepped into the office. "I know about the Gastown restaurant," Stirling said. He looked at his desk. "I was coming from a meeting on Water Street. I saw you through the window." "I know." "I didn't intend to." He stopped. He was not a man who reconsidered sentences midway through. She had never seen him do it. "I moved the contract. I am aware it was not a professional decision." Nola sat down in the chair across from his desk. The same chair she'd sat in the first day, when he'd handed her a spreadsheet and told her to find the problem. "You kept my rent from going up," she said. He was very still. She had found it last week, sorting through her own finances the way she sorted through everything. Carefully, completely. Her building had been acquired by a numbered company 8 months ago. The ownership chain led, eventually, to a holding firm she recognized. The rent for her unit had not increased despite the building-wide restructuring. "I didn't want you to have to move," Stirling said. It came out like a line from a report. A fact delivered the way he delivered everything, as though feeling it were one thing, and saying it was simply a separate transaction he was completing. "That's not something a boss does for an employee," Nola said. He looked at her. "No," he agreed, "it isn't." The rain had come back. She could hear it on the glass. Outside, False Creek was grey and still. "The Elliot situation," Nola said carefully. "I need you to make it right. He has a position in Toronto." "I know what he has. I need you to make it right." She held his gaze. "Call in the favor with whoever you redirected that contract to. Get it restored. He can decide whether to take the Toronto position or stay here. His choice, not yours." Stirling was quiet for a moment, then, "All right." "That's it? Just all right?" "You're asking for something reasonable," Stirling said. "I'll do it." She studied him for a long moment. She thought about the 3 years. She thought about the spreadsheet on the first day and the 11 discrepancies. She thought about the way he'd always listened when she argued, the way he'd changed the Deltaport approach without once acknowledging she'd been right, the way the reading glasses disappeared the moment anyone else might see them. She thought about what it meant to build something carefully, in the margins, without ever naming what you were building. She had done it with his financial architecture. He had done it with her. She wasn't certain which of them had started first. "I want a 20% raise," she said, effective immediately. 25, Stirling said. She almost smiled. "You don't negotiate up on salary requests." "You came back on a Saturday to save the harbour accounts," he said. "The rate is commensurate." Nola looked at him across the desk. He had put the glasses down and was watching her with the same grey, precise attention he gave to everything. But the attention felt different now that she was looking at it directly instead of from the periphery. It had never been clinical. She had been the one who decided to read it that way because it was safer. "I'm not your asset," she said. "I know." His voice was quieter than usual. "I've always known that. I just couldn't." He picked up a pen. "Set it down. I run everything against a cost-benefit analysis. It's how I make decisions. It keeps me from making mistakes." And Stirling said, "It stopped working, approximately 14 months ago. Around the time you argued me out of the Tsavasan contract restructure. I've been recalculating ever since, and the numbers keep coming out the same way." Nola was quiet. "You are not an asset," he said. "You are the only variable I cannot account for, which means you are the only variable that matters." For a man who had never learned the language of saying what he meant, that was, she understood the whole of it. The translated version of everything he hadn't known how to say across 3 years of proximity and ledgers and rain on the window and coffee at exactly the right temperature. She stood up. She reached across the desk and picked up the reading glasses. She folded them carefully and placed them back into his hand. "Put them on," she said. "You need them." He looked at the glasses in his palm. "We have 48 hours, Nola said, settling back into the chair and pulling the keyboard toward her side of the desk. "I'll walk you through the fix. Pay attention, because I'm not going to explain it twice." Stirling put the glasses on. He turned his chair to face the monitor. His shoulder was 2 inches from hers. After a moment, she heard something she hadn't heard before, a low, quiet exhale, not quite a laugh, something closer, a man setting down a weight he had carried so long he had forgotten it had a shape. "The 416 account," she said. "Start there." He pulled the file. She leaned in. Outside, the rain kept coming down on False Creek the way it always did in November, indifferent and steady, the kind of rain that doesn't stop for sentiment. Inside, the numbers began to resolve, one careful entry at a time. There were men in this city who feared Stirling. There were people across 3 provinces who owed him. There were shell companies holding hundreds of millions of dollars that answered, ultimately, to the weight of his signature. And he was sitting in his office on a Saturday, in his reading glasses, following her instructions. She didn't belong to his empire. His empire, she was beginning to understand, had always belonged to her. Some cages, she thought, watching the cursor blink on the screen between them, aren't built to keep you in. Some are built to keep everything else out, until the person inside decides to hold the key herself.